This is our first plenary, and it's a Q&A again, so we're hoping this will be very interactive, but we have 3 speakers, and I'd just like to introduce them to you first before I ask them to deliver some short presentations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from you. To my far right is Sylvia Cox-Duquette. She's the Senior General Counsel at the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. After graduating from McGill University with a law degree in 1986 and before joining the IRB in 2008, she has spent most of her career in the field of Aboriginal law at the Department of Justice. Her last project was on legislation creating a tribunal of Superior Court judges to decide land claims and grievances. And next to her is Furio de Angelis, who studied international relations and international law at the political science faculty of the University of Rome in Italy, where he also obtained a post-university diploma in European studies. Mr. De Angelis has been working with the UNHCR since 1987, and his work has taken him to various refugee operations all over the globe, and to countries such as Afghanistan, Croatia, Pakistan, Turkey, Kenya, Ukraine, and Sudan. His work positions have been in various capacities, including as a field officer, protection officer, and deputy representative. Currently, Mr. De Angelis is the UNHCR country representative in Canada based out of Ottawa. And next to me is Shiva Nourpanah, a Ph.D. graduate student candidate at the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie here in Halifax. She obtained her MA in International Development Studies, during which she conducted field research in the settlement of Afghan refugees in Halifax. She's taught in the area of refugee and forced migration studies at St. Mary's. And prior to arriving in Canada, she worked with UNHCR in Iran for several years in various capacities. And she's also currently a board member at the Halifax Refugee Clinic. And she's spoken around Halifax on refugee issues recently. So I'm really happy to have everyone, our panel here today. And I just, to begin with, like to ask a question to Ms. Cox-Duquette. And I'm just wondering if you can outline for us the recent legislative changes to the refugee determination process, both in terms of the refugee claim process and the appeal process, and how the IRB specifically is implementing such changes. Please welcome Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia. Now I just would like, I'm going to ask you, Mr. De Angelis, if you can provide us with an overview of current crisis situations globally in relation to displacement.
Okay, thank you very much, Morgan, and thanks for inviting UNHCR and me personally to this event. I'm very pleased to be here and engage in conversation with all of you. We'll say something. A lot has been covered by Mr. Logan, and so I will try to add a little bit here and there, but of course, it's a very powerful and experienced presentation is leaving me a little space with respect to the general context on how humanitarian operations are occurring in the world. What I want to say now is starting with few figures, starting with the evolving nature of displacement and also increasing figures. So let's first see the quantitative and the qualitative aspect of displacement. As you know, UNHCR we counted what we have persons of concern. Some of these persons of concern are not necessarily displaced, like, for instance, stateless persons. You know, UNHCR has also a specific mandate on statelessness. It's a mandate which is legally as strong as our mandate on refugees. It's a global, it's a unique, and it's a specific mandate. We have a registered number of 3.5 million, but this is just what is registered. An estimation of statelessness in the world is 12 million. And these are the only category within the persons of concern of UNHCR which would not be necessarily displaced. The others are the regular categories, and the numbers last years were up to 42.5 million of persons on concern displaced. We count, and for the first time, the increase of refugee within this, the proportion of refugees within this number is decreasing compared to the proportion of internally displaced persons. For all reasons that, again, were illustrated, but mainly because of the nature of the new conflicts which we are witnessing. So we have 15.5 million refugees, which includes more or less the 5 million Palestinian refugees, almost 900,000 asylum seekers. As you know, asylum seekers, those seeking asylum before being recognized formally as a refugee, 26.5 million displaced persons. And these are what are the traditionally displaced. That means displaced by conflict within their own country. They have not crossed an international border. They are internally displaced persons. There is no international law as such, as it has been said. However, there are important guidance, which are called the guiding principle of internal displaced, which were formulated in the 90s and are what we call it soft law, but they are important binding, are non-binding, but are important principles because are the first principles of consensus among all countries within how to treat the displacement, which again, in terms of needs, beside the fact that they are within their own country and so engage, legally speaking, the protection of the authorities, but when we come to needs, when we come to protection needs, when we come to gender-based violence, when we come to water and sanitations, are in what we call in refugee-like situations. There are, I want to say, as has been said, is how the displacement changes and evolves in the last years. For instance, two categories which are not formally part of the persons of concern of UNHCR are the displaced for natural reasons. Of course, this is very well known, and we have seen the massive displacement which can occur with respect when very important natural phenomena occur. What's the legal response to that? There has been an initial launch of international principles related to persons who are displaced externally by natural disasters, because as long as they are displaced within their countries, the principles of Mr. Deng, the guiding principle of internal displacement, apply. But what about when someone is displaced by natural disasters outside his own country? So it becomes an international displaced persons per cause of natural disasters. So in June 2011 in Oslo, there was a conference, and 2011 was an important year for UNHCR because it was the 60th anniversary of the 51 Convention, but was also the 150th anniversary of Mr. Fridtjof Nansen, that I'm sure most of you know. He was the first High Commissioner for Refugees in 1929. He was a lot of things. He was a big man with a lot of ideas and a lot of action. He was even a polar explorer. But for us, when we talk about Nansen, we mean it that he's the first High Commissioner for Refugees under the League of Nations. It's also very important for Canada because in 1986, Canada, the people of Canada, has won the Nansen Award. You should know that, you probably know that UNHCR has established an award dedicated to Mr. Nansen, which is given every year to persons, to people, to groups, categories, organizations who have done something particularly relevant for the cause of refugees international. In 1986, this was awarded to Canada. So on that conference in June 2011, the first principles on displacement for natural disasters were listed. And then later on, in November last year, at the margin of the Executive Committee of the UNHCR, which every October takes place in Geneva, Norway and Sweden, Norway and Switzerland, not Sweden, Norway and Switzerland took up the initiative, the Nansen Initiative. So this is an initiative to bring forward this idea of codifying through global consultations, through workshops, to all different events, codifying a legal framework for the first time with respect to external displacement for natural disaster. Another category which is interesting, again, not under the mandate of UNHCR, but I thought that talking about forced displacement, this is interesting to mention it, is the non-citizen displaced by conflict, natural disaster, or political crisis. We should see that this has been particularly visible in the last crisis. But already, for instance, in 2008, you would remember that xenophobic violence displaced between 80,000 and 200,000 migrant workers in South Africa, mainly Zimbabweans. Also, during the crisis in Libya, you would remember that tens of thousands of sub-Saharan migrants were internally displaced because of the civil war and the events, the violent events in Libya, and that presently we estimate that some 120,000 migrant workers in Syria, many of whom are female domestic workers, are found in that situation. So also, this is again a new category coming up. There will be, I'm sure, a discussion and debate how these persons are protected legally. Again, they come, of course, under the larger umbrella of human rights, that's for sure, but there is not specifically mentioned, not even in the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families, which is one of the latest UN convention, international convention, entered into force some 10 years ago, more or less, but not even in that convention, which is so specific to migrant workers, there is this specific category is being taken care. So these are all areas which will be further developed and further, you keep my time, eh? Okay, good. And that was only the introduction because I wanted to, I'm sorry, I wanted to give just a few highlights on the major crises. At this moment, we are witnessing 4 major crises. But when I say 4 major crises, I almost, in a sense, I have to leave behind certain crises which are still not resolved and have been there for so long. For instance, Afghanistan and Somalia, these are old crises which never die, as our High Commissioner has said. But these are there, and they are still very big crises, and they are there. But actually, at the moment, we have 4 emergencies, and I counted before anything else. And this is Syria, and this is Mali, and DRC, and South Sudan. These are the new not even new, but these are the most visible emergencies at this moment, that they are so visible and so emerging that they even allow crises like Somalia go on the back front. And Ian was referring to Kenya. I served there 4 years. I know very well Dadaab. When I was in Dadaab only 4 years ago, the Dadaab camp had 280,000 refugees. And then I left at that time. And we were saying that that's the maximum. You know? Dadaab camp is full. Nobody can come. No, there is no more space for no one. Finished. Today is more than 500,000, the same camp. Well, another one was added. But just to tell you, sometimes the situation which seems absolutely at the extreme, it can get worse. However, the 4 crises we are having in front now, the Syrian crisis is particularly important, not only because of its political angle, which we are not entering, because, of course, we are seeing the humanitarian angle. Only 2 days ago, the High Commissioner released a press release for Syrian refugees reach 1 million. And this was 2 days ago. The press release is in front of me. And that was the planning figure for June 2013 was 1.1 million. Now we are early March, let's say mid-March, 1 million refugees, so we are breaking all planning figures. And what happens? That in these planning figures, which is more than $1 billion that the communities, the international community is asking for the Syrian crisis, 81% is not funded. There is a funding gap of 81%. What are the highlights, really, because only highlights I can give you at this stage. 7,000 refugees arrive per day. So this is the scale of the refugee crisis in Syria. Although already in 2011, we had, in the year 2011, we had an average of refugees per day of 2,000, every single day of the year. But for the Syrian crisis, we are reaching the 7,000 refugees per day. What is the other challenge of this situation? The 61 of refugees live in urban settings, as it was said before. The urban refugee population, enormous challenges in terms of tension with the local population, in terms of identification, in terms of registration. It's important. The first thing we have to do is to register people. Why? It is because you have to know who is who and who is where. Otherwise, assistance can be diverted, assistance can go somewhere else. And so identifying refugees and registering refugees within an urban population which is already suffering or is already deprived is at the moment one of the biggest challenges. Although we say that in the Middle Eastern crisis, the response of the hosting community has been tremendous. More than in other refugee crises, the capacity of the hosting community, not only for the Syrian situation, but also at the time of Tunisia, at the time of Egypt and Libya, the capacity of the Middle Eastern countries to absorb and sustain, at least at the initial phase, refugee population has been enormous. It's been a very positive response. Another area that I have really to say, especially today, is heartbreaking to think that today is the International Women's Day, of course, the 8th of March, but the testimony of our Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Madame Feller, at the Human Rights Committee, and this is also only a few days ago, I just quote a couple of lines from her testimony at the Human Rights Committee. This displacement is not only about loss of homes and economic security, it is also for many accompanied by gender-based crimes, deliberate victimization of women and children, and the frightening array of assault on human dignity. Reports are revealing that the conflict in Syria is increasingly marked by rape and sexual violence employed as a weapon of war to intimidate parties to the conflict, destroying identity, dignity, and the social fabric of families and communities. Child victims becoming a defining feature of the Syrian conflict. This is just the testimony, and I wanted just to quote it, just to again go again to the points made before on how the new nature of conflicts are really taking the population as the main target of the conflicts itself. Do I have another minute? Yes. The other three crises, Mali, DRC, and South Sudan, are very different from the Syrian crisis, mainly urban population, are more typical what we would see refugee situation in the African context, which is characterized by, for instance, dispersion and very difficult terrain. Especially in Mali, there is a situation of scarcity of water. There is a situation of people immediately sitting and staying across the border, which is a dangerous area because of conflict. So the first responses to this situation is, as I said, registration, different level of registration. When we are in emergency, we call it first level of registration is a registration that takes place like this with the glance of you, and you say, okay, around here there are 100 persons, and you close it like this. But then later on you try to register per households and then per individuals, so that then the assistance can be targeted and the special needs of specific individuals can be identified and specific assistance can be given. This is particularly difficult because people have to be relocated. So the first responses to situations, especially in the Mali context, is the relocation of refugees outside or far away from international borders, the registration, and the water. Water and sanitation is becoming a very serious problem in Mali because of scarcity of water, but in other situations like South Sudan, you go to South Sudan and there's plenty of water. It's actually it's too much water. But then is the other problem. And we are seeing in South Sudan there is at this moment an outbreak of hepatitis E, which has already killed more than thousands and thousands of refugees, and this is something that is coming only from waterborne disease and for issues of hygiene and sanitation. The difficulty of terrain and the difficulty of the natural context in which the refugee operation exists in the African operations, this is the main challenge, and this is particularly severe because of the logistics that have to be taking place. The last word I want to say is on how to respond. A lot has been said by Ian on coordination. That slide with all actors like this, and this is all there and it's all true, and so much has to be improved. From the UN system point of view and side, there is a process which is called the transformative agenda, which is the process setting in place by the Interagency Steering Committee in 2005, known as the cluster approach. That means having all organizations working together and divided by clusters of intervention. Now this is taking a step forward with a new name, Transformative Agenda. The concept is the same, but with the Transformative Agenda, which was launched at the beginning of this year, in January, several protocols, 5 protocols have been launched with respect to coordination again, rapid response, and empowerment. That's what is really important in coordination, as people who have seen this know very well, is empowerment of leadership. And of course, this goes against a little bit specific mandates of each organization. UNHCR has a specific mandate on refugees. We remain responsible vis-à-vis General Assembly, vis-à-vis donors, and vis-à-vis Secretary General when a refugee crisis comes in. So UNHCR maintains the general mandate with respect to response to refugee emergencies, but otherwise we also have to be part of this larger effort by all UN agencies to work on rapid response. 72 hours, all UN agencies now have the capacity to deploy within 72 hours experienced emergency personnel into theaters of operation. Release emergency coordinator releasing funds up to 10 million, if I remember well, within 3 days, 72 hours. So that's how this responses mechanism that years ago were not available, the transformative agenda is at the moment the formula and the mechanism that the UN system is trying to put in place. Hopefully it will work. We have to believe that it will work, and we have to see its success in the field, in the operations. I think I can stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Furio. We've heard about what's going on in Canada in relation to policy. I'm sure there'll be more discussion on that over the weekend. And additionally, in our keynote and from Furio, we've heard about the global and international situation. And now we're going to move much closer to home and to the local context. And I'm going to ask Shiva Nourpanah to talk a little bit about the experience of Afghan refugees in Nova Scotia based on her research.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel and giving me the opportunity to present the research that I've done on Afghan refugees in Nova Scotia. I do have to say that I see my presence here as having a kind of twofold function. On one hand, I'm going to do what Morgan said, and that's provide a more provincial, regional, local view of refugee affairs. But I'm also hoping, I don't know whether you are feeling the same, but I haven't been to a refugee event for some time now, and now I'm recalling that familiar sense of frustration and despair and doom as I've listened to Furio, Ian, even my esteemed counterpart from IRB, that it's awful, what are we going to do? All these words of crises and despair and displacement, violence, so I am going to talk about a tiny laser point beam of light, as it were, the other side of the story. People who have been able to use legal channels, which are very few and far between, but still have been able to avail themselves of it and make way into a country such as Canada. That was where my MA research took me. Afghan government-assisted refugees who were identified by UNHCR and able to enter Canada legally and settle here in Nova Scotia. So, I must say, as Morgan mentioned, I used to work with UNHCR in Tehran. I worked as a resettlement assistant. And the prevailing opinion amongst us colleagues was that people who are resettled are not going to have much of a life. They'll have a better life for sure than what they have in Iran. But I mean, in Canada, they're going to be marginalized there, and they're going to be. How can they integrate? How can they build any? They're going to be homesick. I mean, their kids can go to school without fear of stepping on mines. Yay, yippee, that's a great thing, right? But what kind of quality of life are we talking? What kind of future are they going to have? So, and I went into my research with that kind of worldview, and as I was just talking about, it's hard not to have a very dim, negative worldview when you're working with refugees and with refugee affairs. And so I interviewed certain Afghan families, in-depth interviewed, qualitative research as it's known, and I was surprised, given that I had a background of 8 years working with Afghan refugees back in Iran, I was still surprised at my own capacity to be astonished by the resilience, the toughness, the sheer sense of life and hope that these people have brought with themselves into Halifax, their sheer determination to make a home, to build a future for the. It sounds a cliche to say so, but it's true. Maybe that's why it's a cliche. And it's something, and that's going to tie in with what I'm going to say about provincial policy. And it's a cliche, but it's still something which has been overlooked. Refugees are consistently portrayed as silent, voiceless victims. They're suffering victims. It's hard not to do that when confronted with all these disasters, with all these numbers. It's very hard to develop a portrait or a representation of refugees which shows them as active masters of their destiny, who take a part in choosing which path they want to take. I, as a UNHCR member, thought of refugees as being passive people who would be selected by UN, and that is the wording of the resettlement handbook. It was eye-opening to me to talk to people in a different context, in a more familiar, in a research context, as opposed to the kind of specific dynamics of staff member and a client, and to realize how they would describe their life. We got rejected by this office, so we moved to another office. We kept writing letters. My sister, who's literate, kept writing letters. She's very smart. She got us an interview. They would describe their experience of being resettled, of being displaced, of moving around, trying to find solutions in very active, positive terms. And of course, I do want to caution, and I am fully aware that I'm talking about a very small person. Well, those who made it to Canada at least represent a very small percentage of of refugees in general, but I found, and the sense of hope, that the sense that they had of making Halifax their home, it was very much in contrast for me, the optimism they had, the treatment that they had received at the hands of Canadian bureaucrats who welcomed them in as legal refugees into their country, is obviously going very different from the treatment that refugee claimants, for example, receive. So they come into Canada with a very positive, very great sense of arriving at a safe place, arriving at a place where they are welcomed, where they're given services, where they're given assistance. And I think that's an investment that policymakers should take account of, and that's something that policymakers can invest on. I don't know how familiar people are with provincial migration policy here in Nova Scotia, but Nova Scotia is considered to be facing what is called a population crunch, and there a demographic decline. The migration policy here is being crafted to attract more migrants. More immigrants, specifically economic immigrants, or people who migrate under the economic stream or provincial nominee program. The emphasis, and that's also the emphasis of Canadian migration policy in general, is immigrants who can help develop Canada, help assist with the economic development of Canada, which is fine. What I am suggesting is that because refugees are seen always as receivers of charity, that their own resources and their contributions are looked over, and so they're not really figured as possible contributors. As a case in point, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anybody from the Nova Scotia Office of Immigration, the provincial level of government, has attended this conference. There's no mention of refugees in the new immigration strategies which were released in 2010. They are simply not seen as a possible source of contribution, as people who can, in any sense, in any form, create a positive, have a positive role in the development of the home which they are now building, and that is so much contradict what I have heard these people themselves express, how they feel that they are at home, how they are carving careers for themselves, futures for themselves, and so that's one point that I really want to emphasize with that. Oh, sorry, 5 minutes. As my counterpart was talking, I don't know whether you felt the same, but I could see these mountain of papers and this maze of bureaucracy building around, just visualize them as she was talking about these changes and legislative changes, and I was thinking about the human impact while mentally thanking people at Halifax Refugee Clinic and organizations like Halifax Refugee Clinic which assist refugee claimants with navigating through these mazes, and the human impact of these policy changes are places for further research for sure. My research has focused on government-assisted, as I said, government-assisted, who enter in a more positive light. And I am dreaming, perhaps I'm sharing a dream with you, that one day, as in fact Canada has promised, so maybe it's not a dream, that the number of resettled refugees will increase, and there will be less reason for asylum seekers to recourse to such desperate measures to find a safe haven for themselves and their families. I'm referring to a speech by Dr. Shari Aiken from U of O now, who was saying, well, one way of reducing boat people, of reducing asylum seekers, is to increase legal venues of migration. If people felt that they had possible, valid, more short-term ways of removing themselves from difficult situations and accessing safe havens, then maybe they wouldn't be so eager to jump on boats or trust themselves, trust their lives, their livelihoods to traffickers in such dangerous conditions, and then enter a place like Canada and then be faced with what she was talking about right now, right? So Canada has in fact promised to increase spots for resettlement I was just reading last night that in fact has not happened, which somehow does not surprise me. The various crises that Furio was talking about, especially in Syria, were given as the reason why the promised increase in resettlement spots has not taken place. However, it was also mentioned in the same article that temporary foreign workers, the spots for temporary foreign workers has increased, and there's actually more temporary foreign workers entering Canada now than refugees, which provides food for thought. I'll stop here, but yes, I'm happy to take questions on what I've been talking about.
Thank you very much, Shiva. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. So don't all rush to the mic at once, but if anyone would like to ask one of our panelists a question, please do so.
Okay, I hope this doesn't turn into a pick on IRB day, but I do have a question. And it's about these BOC forms, or as I don't know if everyone knows, they're called Basis of Claims form. So at the recent Canadian Council for Refugees working group meetings, there were a lot of issues that were raised in the communities by NGOs about these forms specifically. And you talked about how you made them simpler, but part of the concern, I think, is that some refugee claimants are not getting the information with the forms, and they're literally filling out the forms on the sides of garbage cans and then immediately giving them in. And that has a huge impact. And there were a lot of stories like these that were shared. So it's not just one or two. So this has a huge impact on the way lawyers are then able to represent them in front of the IRB. So I was wondering, you did talk about making them simpler, about sharing information, but is there a process in which NGOs can feed this information to you guys so as to support these claimants? Because a lot of times lawyers can't pick up the BOC forms because there's such a short turnaround.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you confirming what I said yesterday, that there are going to be some bumps as we start up the system. As Sylvia mentioned, the information about how to complete a BOC is given out at the port of entry, or the claimant is supposed to get it if it's an inland claim. And there are clear instructions as to how to fill out the BOC. We consulted extensively on the BOC to make sure that it was drafted in plain language and that it sought only the information that was needed, and that the other information that was needed would be taken by CIC or CBSA at the eligibility interview. If there are problems with the forms, for sure we want to know about it. They're not written in stone, and we will adjust them if we need to. We'll have to give it some time, though. It's too soon to see if there are continuing problems and who has the problems. We mentioned there's a film that's about to come out, which I think will be of great assistance. So, bear with us. But if you have some concerns, please bring them to the attention of the local consultative committee, which includes the IRB and the NGOs. And your representative can bring them forward at the national CCPP, which is the consultative committee meeting, and the clinics are represented, as you know, on that committee. But that's only for concerns that transcend the region. So it may be that you're not the only region that is experiencing problems in the BOC. But you know what? We've done the very best we can to begin with. And we'll adjust if we have to. We listen to our stakeholders.
Okay, thank you, Brian Goodman. Do you have a question? Do you have a question for us? Okay, thank you. I'm glad to see that people are talking. That's what we need to do. Are there other questions?
Najib from Mosaic in Vancouver. I have two questions. First question is for Sylvia, and the basis of claim form need to be submitted in 15 calendar days. Of course, it's very short time, In case the refugee claimant is unable to submit the form within this 2 weeks, what happens? The clients that came to me, I serve refugees in Vancouver, and with the previous system, and they say that they were told by CIC that if they don't show up, they will lose their status. So is it what happens to the refugees that they're unable to file the BOC on time? And my second question is for Furio. Pakistan and Iran were the host for over 5 million refugees from Afghanistan, and majority of those refugees returned back to country when the US and NATO endorsed freedom in 2002. Now that US and NATO is leaving the country in 2014, and considering the growing insurgency in the country, do you think it might create a crisis for UNHCR and when the refugees rush back to Afghanistan? And is UNHCR ready for that? Thank you.
Thanks. Should I reply now? Just quickly, thanks for that question, which gives me the opportunity actually to also say something important. Indeed, Pakistan is the country which is the largest host of refugee population in the world by absolute numbers. I think it's close to 2 million, 1.7, 1.8. But it's also the first country in the world for hosting refugees per capita, according to their $1 GDP per capita versus number of refugees. So this is important to say because according to the early 2012 statistics, 4/5 of refugee populations in the world are in developing countries. So sometimes we lose a little bit track of when we have these large discussions in industrialized countries with respect to the burden that industrialized countries are receiving for refugee assistance and refugee reception of refugees. But the reality is that 4/5 of all refugees in the world are in developing countries. With respect to preparedness for the 2014, well, as I said, Afghanistan has been on the refugee crisis since, I would say, late 70s when there was the revolution, and then early 80s was already a major refugee crisis. It's one of the most protracted and one of the longest unresolved political situations. Before being an unresolved refugee crisis, it is first and foremost an unresolved political crisis. And then, and definitely a political solution, as for all protracted refugee situation, political solutions must be found, and this is not for UNHCR, it's for the countries, it's for the community of countries represented by the General Assembly and by the Security Council of the United Nations. What about preparedness? Of course, we should be prepared, but of course we also have to be careful. There is a political process in courts. Can you imagine what will be starting preparing for an outflow of refugees out of Afghanistan during a political process which actually tries to build up the institutions, build up the state, build up the capacity of the state to survive and to respond and to be a modern state, to be a real state. So all these considerations have to be taken into considerations. And we have to be prepared. We have to build up preparedness for any situation. For any situation, and this is what I said, is being built within the UN transformative agenda, but without putting labels on it. Thank you.
I have a short question for Sylvia. Is there real independence between the immigration policy of Canada and the policy for refugees? Is there an independence, or is there a connection between the two sides?
Okay.
Hi. To ask regarding the role of UNHCR observers in the hearings, I understand it's observing, but I'm curious as to, is there a forum for to report in as far as what they're, quotes, observing, and what exactly are they observing? Are they there, what is their role to serve as protecting of the interests of the refugee that's on trial, or submitting a claim, or is it more to look at the efficacy of the system? And yeah, what like what's, from what angle are they coming from, maybe?
I'm going to ask, you're right, they have the...
Thanks, Sylvie, for that introduction. And surely one of the elements of the refugee reform which we welcome, the creation of the Refugee Appeal Division, first of all, but also this role of UNHCR given within the context of refugee processing, which is double the already existing role of observers that was already there before the latest refugee reform, of being able to observe. This is part of the mandate and the core mandate of UNHCR, which is, you know, according to Article 35 of the 1951 Convention, UNHCR is so-called the guardian of the convention vis-à-vis the application and the implementation of that same conventions in contracting states, in state parties. So UNHCR in several countries, and in Canada too, has this role. That means that we are part of the processing in that respect as a observer, as a guarantor that the application of the convention conforms to the standards and the principles in letters and in spirit with the principles of the convention. We do observations, and then we bring back our observations to the senior management of the IRB in regular meetings that we have, in which we discuss and we have points, and we have an open discussions, of course, open within ourselves. These are not public discussions. These are not things which go out of our bilateral cooperations, because an element also of UNHCR mandate is that we can engage the governments in discretion, in confidence, and this is an important element of the supervision role, the supervisory role that UNHCR has vis-à-vis the implementation of the convention.
I should just mention...
We fortunately have a very long lunch, but I don't want the food to be cold when we get there. So I am just about ready to break the session. But before I do, I just want to say that I think this very broad and complex discussion that we're having here, and the three presentations that we had, raised, I think, a number of issues that hopefully we can explore more specifically in the panels and in our two more plenaries that we're having. And I just want to... so I just, before we break, I just wanted to ask one question to Shiva. And just if, Shiva, if you could speak a little bit about the context of, we've talked about refugees and the wider system, but we haven't really talked about the context of the Maritimes. And very briefly, could you maybe just raise a few points about what kind of an environment Halifax is for refugees? And yeah, so could you address that?
Well, 99% of the government-assisted refugees are resettled into Halifax, so I am going to limit my comment to Nova Scotia are resettled into Halifax, so I'm going to limit my comments to Halifax as opposed to the broader maritime picture, as it were, and I conducted my research with refugees who were resettled here. Those refugees to whom I talked to found Halifax to be, and again it's a cliche to say so, but they found it to be a very accessible and welcoming place. That's not to say they did not have like social interactions or socialize with like Canadian-born people as such. They did confine their socialization and interaction with people of the same nationality whom they met through the immigrant service agency here. But compared to larger cities, and there have been studies actually sponsored by Metropolis which indicate that in larger cities, the MTV for Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, refugees and low-income immigrants have, for example, very difficult time accessing suitable housing. Homelessness has become a big issue there, and so on. There hasn't been that there haven't been those sorts of issues in Halifax, as far as I'm aware. All of them speak about how and they cover a wide political range of people. Like there are women who are covered, who cover their hair and so on. There are women who are not. They all speak about how safe they feel, basically, walking around. And of course, that's not to say that I'm aware of the local issues going on in Halifax, but we always have to put this in context about where they come from. For example, one man I remember saying that he used to live in Shiraz in the south of Iran, and every day there would be other people shouting at his daughters as they went to, well, for one thing, as they went to school. I mean, sometimes they could go to school, sometimes they couldn't go to school. But there would be men shouting things at his daughters, and he was afraid to, like, what? And he was like, what could I say? What did I do? Like, I can't start up, because they are actually considered aliens in Iran. That's the official nomenclature for them. And here he says his daughters walk around in full hijab and nobody even looks at them. That's cool. That for him, that's like, for them, that's something that is worthy, and it's worth the homesickness, the travel, not knowing the language. I would say that socio-culturally, perhaps they are not so much connected into mainstream Canadian society, but then which one of us is really? But in a legal physical protection sense, that kind of the benefits that they have kind of outweigh the social cultural marginalization. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Okay, thanks very much, Shiva, and our other panelists, Furio and Sylvia. And thank you all for coming and for the great questions.